Hi, my name is Allison Fisher. I work for Apollo Education Group in the Ethics and Compliance Department.
I'm Kelly Knickerbocker. I work for National GRAD in the Ethics and Compliance Department.
My name is Carsten Zemmer. I am Head of Ethics and Compliance Program Office within Airbus.
Okay. And you are going to introduce yourselves in the 30-minute presentation, right?
Sure.
Okay. Let's see. Is there anything else I'm supposed to do? My name's Mike Hoffman. I said to you all. And I am supposed to be the Uber judge, whatever that is, which means that during the 20-minute Q&A, I'll start off by asking a question. And then you'll get feedback after the Q&A from our judges. Okay? Okay, let's get started. Let me see. Let me get my timer in sync. I didn't know how you do this.
It's okay.
Sure.
You're good at this.
Oh.
I know, because I saw you do yours.
I need to get mine back to 0, and I thought all I had to do was hit
You
this.
have to hit stop first and then clear.
Now. Okay.
Should be good, yeah.
Now it should be good. Oh, okay. We all set?
We are.
All right, here we go. You're on.
In April 2013, more than 1,000 factory workers lost their lives in the tragic collapse at Rana Plaza in Dhaka, Bangladesh. The collapse was thought to be due to poor building regulations and faulty construction, but Bangladeshi workers have been crying for more safety and better working conditions since 2010. Shortly after this incident, the International Labor Organization and multiple Bangladeshi worker labor unions collaborated and created what's called the Accord on Fire and Building Safety for Bangladeshi workers. But GATT missed this opportunity when they failed to sign the accord and instead created their own in-house guidelines called the Alliance on Bangladeshi Safety, which fails to meet the stringent conditions and enforceable accountability that the accord did. GATT currently stands at a crossroads. They can maintain the status quo and continue on their course, trying to recover the international backlash from their association, from the involvement in Rana Plaza, and their failure to sign the accord, and the perception that they don't have a global social consciousness. Or they can take our recommendations, which include signing the accord, and revolutionize what it means to be a global fashion retailer. Today's presentation includes 3 things. First, we're going to look at oversight, which deals with our legal compliance and the interrogation of what it means to be compliant in an international situation as far as the legal guidelines go for the Accord versus the Alliance. That will be presented by our legal representative, Mr. David Tamez. The second portion of this will look at action, which will be facilitated by our financial representative, Ms. Colleen Watson, who will look at the trajectory of GATT's financial investments and the fallout they faced from their lack of social consciousness and their failure to sign the accord. Before finally, me, Shanna Schultz, presenting you with our enterprise component, which is our ethical framework that we like to call the Golden Rule Standard of Engagement. But before I elaborate about what it means to be an ethical business implementing our Golden Rule Standard, I'd like to allow Mr. Tamez to come up and show you the legal differences and what it means to be legally compliant versus the Accord and the Alliance.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. Again, my name is David Tamez, and I'll be going over some of the legal implications GATT will incur in signing the accord. So in my analysis of the legal implications, I want to address the following issues. First, what are some of the conditions that prompted the formation of both the Alliance and the accord? Second, what are some of the legal barriers that prevent GATT from signing the accord? Finally, what are some of the legal responsibilities GATT will incur in signing the accord? First, let's consider the conditions that prompted the formation of both the Alliance and the Accord. Bangladesh, after all, Bangladesh is a sovereign, autonomous state subject to its own laws and its national constitution. So why do we need foreign corporations to come in and assist in their inspections of factories and the overall safety of their workers? Well, Bangladesh is the second most productive garment industry in the world. They have over 24,000 factories and over 3 million facilities and workshops, and 2 major ports. But they only have 80 inspectors to inspect all of those facilities. So their infrastructure or their laws are just not enough to supplement the demand that comes with being the second most productive garment industry in the world. So they need assistance, and that's where the Accord and the Alliance come into place. But we want to argue that the Accord is much more of a helping hand, a fully extended hand of assistance than the Alliance. So support comparisons. The Accord currently has 72 signatories that subscribe to it. And it's also backed by Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, the International Labor Organization, multiple Bangladeshi labor unions, U.S. congressional leaders, and European Parliament. The Alliance, however, is only backed by, have 20 corporations that subscribe to it. And they're only backed by national retail federations, retail industry leader associations, Retail Council of Canada, and the United States. So only 2 countries, whereas the Alliance is composed of multiple countries, primarily in Europe and some in the United States. And I also want to emphasize that the ILO is also a signatory of the Accord. So they have a place or a role in the inspection and the overall adherence to the Accord. And so finally, what are some of the legal implications of signing the Accord? Well, I want to point to the differences of enforcement. The Accord empowers workers. It also provides arbitration procedures and legal protection for these workers. So if they have a complaint, and if their working conditions are not up to par, they can bring their complaints to a third-party representative, most likely of the ILO, and then the steering committee judges whether or not to bring a case against the corporation that subcontracts to the factory in question. The Alliance, however, which GAP again currently subscribes to, is not enforceable by workers. It has limited access to resolution or solutions by workers. Companies face minimal penalties for terminating membership. So again, the Alliance and the Accord are voluntary in terms of coming together, of these corporations coming together and signing to them. But the Alliance also allows corporations to opt out of providing support. The Accord does not. It is a legally binding agreement between these corporations for 5 years. You cannot opt out. And now I want to hand it over to my colleague, Ms. Watson, for the financial implications.
Thank you. Our recommendations here are not anti-capitalist. What we're advocating is a sort of sustainable capitalism. And this sustainable capitalism has historical precedent dating all the way back to Adam Smith. And this is not a sort of capitalist interpretation like laissez-faire capitalist, which is much more narrow-minded. This interpretation is much broader in scope. In Smith's work, Preceding the Wealth of Nations, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith points out that it's moral empathy and social responsibility that can sustain businesses and markets. Consider this quote from Moral Sentiments. As we have no immediate experience of what other men feel, we can form no idea of the manner in which they are affected. But by conceiving that we ourselves should feel in the same situation. We want to suggest that this interpretation of capitalism is harmonious with our golden rule standard. Since the 1990s, this interpretation has been recognized as the triple bottom line by many businesses. The triple bottom line has been advocated by other business ethicists such as John Eichert and Bob Willard, and it points out that economic profits are not mutually exclusive to adherence to environmental sustainability and social responsibility. Now, I think a lot of us here in this room have heard of the non-profit organization Fair Trade International. Yes? Then you're just like 6 out of 10 consumers across the globe. 9 out of 10 of these consumers trust the fair trade label. This points out that there's a market that needs to be met for consumers who are demanding social transparency in the products that they buy. Other companies are winning this game. Companies like New York-based clothing retailer Zadie and eyewear retailer Warby Parker are already making commitments to social transparency and social responsibility. I have up here 2 quotes by Maxine Badat. She's the co-founder of Zadie, and Anjali Kumar, who is a social innovation officer at Warby Parker. This just shows you how other businesses are ahead of this game. And other companies that are comparable to Gap, their direct competitors like American Eagle and H&M, have already signed the accord. They can use those policies against Gap in the consumer demand for social responsibility. This is a picture taken from Gap's official Facebook page. Gap put this up as just an ad debuting their new spring line. Underneath that ad is a comment thread by many consumers berating Gap for not signing the accord. These are angry consumers that are coming against Gap to express their distaste with Gap's lack of social responsibility. These are consumers that you can see their face, you know their names, and you are losing money from these people. And you can't hide from this sort of beratement. Your social media presence is key to any viable advertising campaign, and that necessitates consumers having a direct line to you. Not only are you losing money from these particular people, but other people who are going to go onto Gap's Facebook page are going to see this and be driven away by this comment thread. And a great resource online is goodguide.com. Good Guide rates products and brands based on their environmental impact, their health impact, and their social responsibility. It gives consumers access to lots of information over this. Currently, Gap is not doing too hot on goodguide.com. In fact, right now, it is rated as a 4.8 out of 10 for social responsibility. And this doesn't even take into account the accord. I was very lucky to be in personal correspondence with a chief scientist of goodguide.com, Dr. Bill Peace, who told me that the rankings currently don't take into account the accord, but they plan on redoing the rankings very soon, in which case they will be taking into account who has signed the accord and who has not. So Gap has the potential to actually sink even lower in its social responsibility ratings. As my colleague, Mr. Temez, pointed out, one of the key concerns in the alliance versus the accord is the lack of oversight. Under the alliance that Gap is currently a part of, independent inspections are not necessitated. I have pulled this quote from a New York Times article, and it displays how the alliance inspectors are already failing in their jobs. An inspector associated with Walmart went in to inspect a garment factory and came back and said that the factory was fine, it looks good. But when an independent inspector from the Accord went in, they found serious structural issues that had to be taken into account that were pressing concerns. You can see that the alliance is already failing. Now, if Gap can't trust itself to bring in independent oversight, how is Gap supposed to expect customers to trust Gap? As you all know, any company cannot be viable in the long run without innovation. And independent oversight, we think, is key to innovation. If Gap does not sign the accord, it's only going to see what it wants to see in its inspections. It's not going to have the ability to grow, to innovate for the future. Signing the accord is going to give Gap a much brighter future in innovation. $1.25 billion are lost each year due to damages from worker safety complaints. Now, GAP has to put in $500,000 annually to invest in factory upgrades for the factories it contracts out with. But as it stands with the Alliance, GAP already pays out $1 million per year in investment. So by signing the accord, you're already cutting your costs in half. $500,000 is a minuscule amount compared to how much money GAP makes. But added into the pool of $500,000 from other companies across the accord, that can take a large chunk out of that $1.25 billion. Thank you. And now I'm going to hand it back over to our Chief Ethical Officer, Ms. Jan Schultz.
Thank you, Ms. Watson. Both David and Colleen have given you very pragmatic and tangible advantages to signing the accord. But the question still remains, what does GAP have to do to become an emerging leader in ethical business practice? Some would argue that it's a government's responsibility of the host nation's country to enforce and create safer working conditions. But as Scott Nover from the Human Rights Consortium notes, the true power lies within Western retailers and brands such as GAP because they hold the key to worker safety and reliability. This is where GAP's chance emerges to take on that role and become a leader. The framework we would like to offer for this ethical business practice is called the Golden Rule Standards. Essentially, it has a universality that's recognizable due to its religious basis and connotation and its historic etymology. But fundamentally and simplistically, it can be noted that the Golden Rule Standard simply means do to others as you would have them done to you, given your perspective on the same situation. Luckily, ethicist Robert Solomon gives us 4 basic business virtues for corporations that operate as a guideline for how to implement the Golden Rule Standard in things like operating protocols, business vision, and international contracting and relations. Those 4 business issues are honesty, toughness, fairness, and trust. We're going to go through them. So first, what does it mean to have an honest corporation, at least in the context of a basic virtue ethic? Essentially what this means is disclosure. Anytime a person enters into contract or takes a risk, there's a certain amount of uncertainty. What this tenant is offering is that disclosure looks like things like business planning, long-term vision, and strategic planning. So when you're a person who's offering a contract up to a vulnerable working population, it's not just about the benefit of the payment or what kind of wage they're going to get, but rather they're entitled to know what the long-term standing of the corporation is in their community, where their role as a worker is in that corporate plan, and what it means for them as workers, not only in the context of the corporation, what it means for their livelihood as well. Full disclosure doesn't have to be things like how we outcompete our competitors or what kind of strategic management we do, but rather all the information that's required for a person to enter into a contract on mutually agreeable terms, which is something that GAP fails to do currently, because they only enter into a contract with workers by saying, well, here's your benefits and here's the financial compensation, without recognizing what GAP's true interest in having them there in the first place. The second component is toughness, which is often confused as being odious, but when combined with perseverance, it can actually be quite virtuous. Look at Ms. Watson's analysis when she looks at the financial trajectory of GAP. Clearly, GAP has taken a tough stance on trying to face back some of the international issues that has come as a result from the Rana Plaza collapse and their failure to sign the accord. As opposed to some people who failed to engage with their consumers at all on the issue, GAP is at least trying. However, we think that they can increase their toughness by signing the accord, which has strict guidelines and measurements, as David has already told you. It can increase their toughness on being socially conscious and globally responsible, not necessarily how financially tough they are. We think that's a key component. The third one is fairness. And this is a basic principle for all business, but essentially what this means for contractors and consumers is how dependable and mutually agreeable you are when you engage in those contracts. So particularly for vulnerable populations, like workers in developing nations, fairness looks like contracts that take in their unique needs as workers. GAP can no longer engage with these populations the same way they do with workers in the Western world or already developed nations. They have to take in the unique constraints and needs that these populations have, such as food access, transportation, or health guidelines. By taking in those variables into contract management, you create a fair system in which people enter in as true agents of themselves and not just a determinant on how much money we can exploit from them for cheap labor. The fourth component is trust, and it's greatly linked to fairness. But as many of you know, trust in a corporation is vital for sustainable growth and the foundation of good business management. Fundamentally, if workers, consumers, or potential investors don't trust the corporation, their sustainability ultimately falters because there's no guarantee that the company will continually progress. When we talk about ethical guidelines and sustainable business management, it's important for that trust component to be there because the public backlash and the international outcry for GAP's involvement in the Rana factory collapse, as well as their failure to sign the accord, has had great impact on their financial improvement. So the fact is by utilizing the trust component, you can build up that corporation. Detrimentally, if trust is broken, it's incredibly hard to get back, as we've noted for the last year, as GAP's resources have continually been going down because of their failure to sign this accord. Now, what happens when we implement these 4 tenets through the Golden Rule Standard? What kind of tangible benefits can GAP see? Well, there's 3. Increased cultural sensitivity, increased brand loyalty, and corporate growth. So first, cultural sensitivity. As noted previously, when engaging with vulnerable populations such as developing countries' workers, you can't make the same kinds of contracts you do for those who work in Europe or the United States. The contracts have to take into account some other factors. It's not just good enough to pay them some sort of wage and say that's good enough that I financially compensated you, but rather it's the responsibility of an ethical corporation to take into all accounts of what that worker's life looks like so that you may enhance their human capital and not just the corporate financial capital. The second part is increased brand loyalty. From Ms. Watson's analysis, it's clear that the GAP logo is looked at as blood tainted and people do not want to consume it. For the socially conscious consumer, they want to wear a logo that represents their personal ideals. By implementing our 4 tenets, you begin to build up the brand of GAP as socially conscious and not socially reprehensible, to where people wear it as a symbol of pride and not of one of shame. The third is increasing corporate growth. Because brand loyalty doesn't just relate to consumers, it relates to employees as well. From the lowest bottom of the retail worker to the highest investors, people like to take pride in their working environment. They don't want to work for corporations that don't ideologically line up with their own view of reality, and they want to take pride in going to work every day. So even if you're the employee that's running the cash register, or you're the high-level investor that's making financial resources, you want to know that your time, your effort, and your money are going towards something that you find sustainable, that you find believable, and something that represents your ideals. By implementing these measures, you get that component of corporate growth. GAP is facing a social legitimacy crisis. As Al Jazeera notes in 2014, the stench of death still rests on the factory site, and that stench is following GAP where they go. They can no longer hide from their responsibility and their accountability by failing to sign the accord. We recommend the following. First, sign the accord on fire and building safety. We've given you clear analysis on how this is beneficial to not only GAP's enterprise with engaging with vulnerable populations, but furthermore, how it represents a symbolic dedication to social consciousness. The second is revolutionize your business ethics by integrating the Golden Rule Standard of business, by infusing it with the lifeblood of your corporation, by making it part of your business vision, and not just an afterthought of public relations backlash. By doing this, GAP becomes the flagship of retail factory working and becomes a new standard for what other businesses should compete towards. And the last is cultivate international ethical compliance. When GAP takes this step to do this and begins to infuse these types of policies into the way that they interact both domestically and globally, they set the standard because they're one of the first who would actually do it. And it's their time to step into the light and do that. Today we've reviewed the legal implications of not signing the accord and where GAP stands legally by only remaining in the alliance. We looked at the financial problems that have come from not signing the accord, as well as the trajectory that could happen once they sign the accord and revolutionize their business practice, before finally offering up an innovative solution, an ethical framework for how GAP can redo their business practice and rechange their vision by actually becoming globally conscious about all their workers, not just the ones that you can get cheap labor from or the one that you can get the most about the product. Instead, investing in human capital that returns investments in financial products, not just looking at the financial benefits. As Bangladeshi families begin to rebuild and recover, GAP stands at that crossroads. The ability to continue walking and trying to rebuild that public backlash, or taking the chance to revolutionizing their ethical practices and taking a stand for global consciousness. Once they take our recommendations and implement our guidelines, GAP can finally lift the blood from their shirts and begin to be an ethical business practice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we start our questions and answers, I didn't give you an opportunity, which I apologize for letting these people know what role they should play. And so would you tell them what role they're playing before we start the Q&A?
Sure, you're the board of directors for GAP Incorporated, and we're your consulting team.
And you're the consulting team.
Right.
Just a point of clarification. Didn't you introduce somebody as the ethics and compliance officer?
That's me.
That's you?
Yeah.
Of the consulting group?
Yes.
Got it. Okay, now, if you'll set your timer, I will set mine. I think. Oh, goody. It's working. Okay, are we ready?
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. Questions from the board? I'm supposed to start, so I'm going to be also on the board. You know, I think we have a pretty ethical company as it is, and we were very instrumental in starting the Alliance. And I don't know why our reputation would be enhanced that much as long as we live up to our values in that alliance and be a leader within that alliance. I'm not sure I'm convinced that we have to join the Accord in order to show people that we're an ethical leader. I wonder if you could respond to that.
Well, I think that the main concern with the Alliance is that there's a lack of independent oversight. And because consumers can go online and they can look at comparisons of the Alliance versus the Accord, they can see that GAP's inspectors are really being paid by GAP themselves. And it's pretty easy to infer from that GAP is going to send people that they are paying to come back and tell them what only GAP wants to hear.
So it's like conflict of interest.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I see. And why is that conflict of interest bad?
Well, we think it's really critical to note that in the Accord that's been constructed by the labor unions, that there's worker representation. So when we're looking at strategic engagement with these populations, it's really important to make sure that they have a representative voice, because these populations don't often have a sense of agency in their own communities or governments, much less their ability to arbitrate or seek resources in the corporations that are contracting with them. The Alliance doesn't really offer for this. It allows for them to take their grievances to their management, and it's up to that person's discretion whether or not they pursue those grievances. But under the Accord guidelines, those workers have representation in councils and can actually continually seek the solutions that they're looking for, whether it's through arbitration, like you see at higher level grievances, or just regular mediated conflict management. That's a really critical shift in the way that GAP deals with contracting vendors in other countries, because for a lot of these developing nations, the notion of justice is very slim for them. But when GAP has the opportunity to facilitate that in the corporate workplace, or at least as vendors, then you begin to see that facilitated as a more conscious kind of approach, rather than just saying, well, you need to take it to your boss and they'll figure it out. That doesn't allow for much sense of advocacy or even agency.
Thank you. My colleagues may have questions as well.
So you mentioned that the GAP logo is pretty much perceived to be tainted with blood by consumers and and it sounds like your recommendation is for us to sign the Accord. But I'm really concerned, because if with all of our loyalty that's diminished, as you say, how is signing the Accord really going to be enough? I mean, what beyond that would you really recommend to increase the brand loyalty and trust from consumers and the general public?
Well, as we saw on the image of the Facebook thread, consumers know what the Accord is, and they know that GAP is not a part of it. So just by having their name associated with the Accord, it gives them a greater step back from that blood that they've got on them, and the consumers are going to know that.
Also, additionally, the Accord is considered the standard in the international economic sector. Also, GAP has on its website that it believes in the freedom of association, yet the alliance doesn't have any trade unions as part of their signatories. The Accord does, and so. But what they can do additionally, because the Accord, both the Accord and the alliance are limited in scope, so they only address the safety and the working conditions in Bangladesh. Some people have suggested that they talk about worker wage and increase the worker wage of the Bangladeshi workers, and that certainly could be a further step forward, because we not only recommend that they sign the Accord, but they go further in implementing the golden standard, the golden rule standard in other areas in their relationship with the Bangladesh government and other countries.
Signing the Accord is foundational to taking those extra steps that are going to come with adopting the Golden Rule standard as, a part of corporate life in general.
Well, and there's a second component to that, right? Like, I think it would probably be short-sighted to say, well, just by signing this Accord, then boom, like everything is magically works out well for your consumers. But for that population that is socially conscious, right? The people who are researching this stuff and making some sort of proactive decision about what kinds of products they want, those consumers will get the information that you've signed the Accord, and that'll be great. But the second component that we think is really critical is changing the ethical framework. We know that GAP advertises on their website and through their protocol that they have a commitment to social legitimacy, but they fail to take that off the pages when they don't engage strategically with these populations, right? Like the fact that this building collapse has happened and that there was a fire and that workers have been looking for this kind of recourse since 2010 indicates that GAP isn't doing any kind of real movement in changing the way that they engage, right? So that's why we want the ethical framework to be a foundational component, because then that starts to emerge as part of the brand, right? You can do a little bit of rebranding by taking in the ethical component. So you're probably right, it's not just good enough to sign the Accord. You have to take both recommendations in order for it to fundamentally revolutionize the way that people perceive the brand.
With regard to the independent inspections, have you done any comparison? I know you pointed to a specific instance of Walmart's inspector not catching some things. Do you have a comparison? How are the independent inspectors doing in comparison to the Alliance inspectors?
Both the Alliance and the Accord are still in their initial stages of development or implementation. The Alliance recently came out with a 6-month progress report, and they list that there's still progress to be made, that there's still transparency issues, but there is no real but they don't provide any real data in terms of their inspections. But whereas the Accord does, they have a full spreadsheet of the findings, their development plan of how to bring about or action plans of how to bring about the solutions. But the Alliance is very skeletal in terms of developing specific action plans to make sure that the working conditions are improved.
And how are the independent inspectors paid? Who's responsible for their paycheck?
So each of the corporations in the Accord and the Alliance have to pay $500,000 each yearly, and part of that fund goes towards paying these inspectors and also going towards training Bangladeshi inspectors themselves to go about and so they can do the inspections moving forward, because both the Accord and the Alliance are five-year plans. Eventually, they want to give it up to the Bangladeshi government to proceed with the inspections.
So wouldn't their inspectors have the same conflict of interest type concern?
Go ahead.
They're coming out of the workers' unions and the Bangladeshi government themselves. They're not being hired by Walmart and Gap and other members of the Alliance. They're being hired by workers' unions who are also putting in a little bit of the financial weight, while the members of the Accord put in most of the financial weight. They're not doing the finding and hiring of these inspectors.
And I think there's I would like to add two things to that. So a little bit of background before GAP and other enterprises created the Alliance, or even before the Accord came into existence. GAP was part of more inspections looking at kind of building and regulatory things. And the reports that are public for you to look at still indicate failures, right? But the problem is because these are all in-house inspection, there's no repercussion to having a failure, right? Like the fact that they were breaking low on structural support in the GAP report doesn't indicate anything. They don't do anything about it because there's no teeth to being in-house regulated other than, oh, we should take note of this because this might be problematic in the future, which is where you got the 2013 collapse. So when you have the Accord, it requires action on that behalf. And so then instead of just saying, like, we recognize there's a problem, the Accord requires for there to be some sort of fix to it, whether it's through collaboration, through the steering committee, or through the corporation itself, requires for some action to be taken. The second thing the Accord does that the Alliance doesn't is the Accord takes into other situations outside of working conditions. So the Alliance looks at, do they have access to bathrooms? Are there like clear fire escapes? Can they, is there air conditioning if need be, right? That's what the Alliance looks at. But the Accord looks at that plus if these corporations allow for dormitories, right? For a lot of these factories, they allow for living on premises because they work long hours. The Alliance looks at those types of conditions as well, taking into that cultural part that the Alliance fails to recognize. And I think that's a really critical distinction that should be noted, is that when you participate in the Accord inspections, it looks at these kinds of externalities that the Alliance doesn't.
Did you do, or did you have any, maybe I missed that throughout your presentation? I have to admit we have a problem here, that's clear. I mean, with the things which happened in Bangladesh. And but for me, what would be of interest for me is also, did you do some benchmarking on the companies who signed the Accord, saying, well, what does it really meant in terms of financial figures? And I mean, I don't want to be not politically correct, but I would really like to see the difference which would have make being a part of the Accord or not compared to our competitors.
The Accord has a sort of a sliding scale for financial responsibility. So huge companies like H&M and American Eagle that are making about as much money as Gap are going to pay the maximum amount is $500,000 annually. We don't have the figures up right now, but I think it has about 5 different five tiers of financial responsibility. So smaller companies who are not making as much money don't have to pay quite as much as companies like American Eagle or Gap. But all companies with the Accord do have to shoulder some financial responsibility. And that financial responsibility goes into not only paying the inspectors, but paying for some of those upgrades in the factories. And we see that as a direct investment, that we can actually capitalize on the investments and make our garment industry a little bit more efficient by investing in safety upgrades to these factories.
But do you have any proof for that, saying that the investment really brings additional customer, the customer recognizes that these companies invest in that area.
Right.
Or is it in the end doesn't really make a difference? When they buy something. Is there any proof that it? Because I'm looking for, I'm paying this $500,000 or whatsoever. For me, it's really also the question: what is it? Because you mentioned it in your presentation that there is a global growth associated with that. But are there any proof on that? Is there any evidence you can give on what it really would mean in terms of in financial growth for the company?
So looking at correlative information, if you so obviously the factory collapse happened in 2013, and so there's really only been about a 6 to 8 month implementation process of the Accord versus the Alliance. So the data set is like relatively small, but so there's a couple of things that can be looked at. So the good guy references that we've talked about obviously calculates how people perceive the corporations. The competitors such as H&M and American Eagle that both do fashion retailing in the same price bracket they have better social legitimacy, right? So as opposed to GAP, and it's pretty apparent that like there's going to be consumers that are going to buy a product for whatever reason, or like it's by their house, or if there's a sale, they got a coupon in the mail, whatever. We're not really talking about those populations. We're talking about the populations that buy the product and then like get really irritated or really upset and burn them all because they've done something socially atrocious. For those groups, there is a noticeable difference between people, like it's designated as pro-cotting, right? We're not going to buy your product, but instead we're going to buy your competitor's product to indicate our association with their brand values. So like when you have Gap and H&M next to each other, the socially conscious consumer does pick H&M over Gap, at least according to some of the stuff that has been put out on like forum boards, the goodguy.com report, and as well as like the social media stuff. And as far as like financial records, those are a little bit harder to come across as far as like public people. But in general, the social chatter and the way that people verbally pass around the brand name indicates that the competitors are winning out because of that role. Like, even though there are these populations that are going to just buy whatever meets their needs or whatever they can find, the ones that you want to worry about are the ones who taint or promote the brand name itself. So there is, at least in this small time frame that it existed, a noticeable difference in the way that consumers interact with the fashion based on that, especially for clothing, where you literally brand yourself with the logo, right? Especially for Gap that advertises like sweatshirts and t-shirts with Gap on it. They reject that because of what it means.
I haven't read our values and mission statement for a long time. I apologize to the board for that. But I'm sure our consultants have taken a look at that. Do our values in our mission statement demand that we be this ethical? I mean, I want to be an ethical company, but there's a lot of risk to this. I mean, the risk, it seems to me, is that if you are a member of the Accord, then you become much more legally liable for problems that could occur. And sometimes it's very difficult to control those problems when you're dealing in countries that are far away. And there are people who do things that they ought not to do. And it's going to cost us a lot of money to monitor that. And even after monitoring it, it can still happen. And then we are legally liable for that. Whereas being a part of the alliance, we're not necessarily legally liable for issues that occur. The courts seem to have indicated that it's up to the liability falls on the management of that factory. Could you respond to that?
Well, there is a steering committee that is formed within the Accord, and that's composed of 3 representatives elected by the corporations that are of the signatories of the Accord, and 3 of some of the trade unions and stockholders that have their own concerns. So that whenever incident occurs in one of these factories, the complaint is posed to the steering committee, and then they decide from there which action is best to go, whether legal action is required to make sure that the injured parties are compensated fairly. It also deals with the issue of liability. So it determines it will determine that as well. In terms of that. So if it was a foreseeable accident, or is one that occurred due to poor inspections or poor implementation of the standards, then yeah, you might be legally liable. But if it was of the character that you insinuate, then they will take a vote on it, and they might judge it upon the merit of the evidence provided.
So we might be off the hook if it was not our fault, if we had done everything we could to have prevented that from happening.
Correct. But action will still take place. If legal action is not necessary, then they'll implement another sort of action plan to correct.
Do you find that being this ethical is somehow embedded in our mission statement and in our values?
It should at least try to be. So one of the components, so GAP has several different components on like what they dedicate to growing economically, what they dedicate to growing like their brand, and what they dedicate to being an international corporation. Because for companies that don't do anything internationally, their constraints are different. But for GAP, who has a very international brand and contracts with these other kinds of factories, they claim they're committed to social and global responsibility. It's a huge tab on their website, and it's something they market to their employees. The problem is that you have situations like this that fly in the face of that commitment, and it becomes cognitive dissonance for employees, consumers, and anyone else who takes the effort to look into it. So I would argue, yeah, there is a commitment to this ethical compliance. And as far as what it means to be globally responsible, they seem to be failing at the point that they recognize that there was structural problems in the first place from their own inspections, and yet lost 1,000 lives. That's no number to be like, you know, to brush off.
They being us, right?
Yeah, sorry, excuse me, y'all. That you lost fundamentally, and it's taking a lot to recover from that. And it's clear that just by creating this alliance with a few other fashion retailers and partnerships isn't doing enough. So if we as GAP are going to claim that we're committed to global responsibility, then ethics has to go up to meet that requirement, because the action has already shown that we have failed to meet those guidelines. And as far as, you know, monetary investment, as Colleen noted, we pay out like $5 million in worker compensation and problems in the first place. But as we noted from David's analysis, by utilizing the Accord, it functions more as prevention than it does as liability, which is cost saving no matter what.
That's a good way to end it. I want to say, wonderful job, and
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, me too. I gotta shut this up. Stop.
You just respond to verbal commands.
Stop.
Response to force.
I'm too old to have this technology. So thank you. That was really great. And you know, another thing I failed to do, I think, at the beginning was to allow you to just tell us what you're majoring in. I know you're from Texas State, but
My name's Colleen Watson. In 3 days, I'll have a master's degree in applied philosophy and ethics.
Wow.
My name is David Tamez, and I am also majoring in mastering in applied philosophy and ethics. Sorry, it's our MAP program, or MAAP as we like to call it. Yeah, but I still have 2 semesters left.
I'm also a master's student at Texas State. I'm studying communication studies, specifically in rhetorical methods of research.
great. So we have some time for some feedback from our panel. As I explained to the judges, you all are not through yet.
No, there's more.
Tomorrow is another day, and you have a 10-minute presentation, and then in the afternoon, I think a 90-minute presentation.
Right.
So
Second.
Yes.
That's a whole
90
movie.
seconds, right? I knew that.
Well, there goes what my feedback was going to be. For one, is you're really good at public speaking. You have very good,
Thank you very much.
the inflection, the eye contact. I was going to say, slow it down just a little,
Sure.
but if you only have 90 seconds, I don't know.
Word economy is.
I think you guys did a great job. I liked how you outlined the presentation and explained your different roles, and you role played those well, and I would agree. You have a great presentation and communication style. I think what you really sealed it for at the end was relating it back to our mission, or GAP's mission and values, and why, really kind of hook, line, and sinker that buy-in. Because I felt that it was clearly a problem, and I felt drawn into your presentation, but feeling that motivation to really, go with your proposal and tying it back as to why it's important, and it's important because it's one of the core values. If you're when you have a shorter presentation, tie it in. Why is it meaningful to us? Get our buy-in right away. I think you'll do great.
Yeah, but it's the same for me. I would say that you did a great job and that everything was well analyzed, and the arguments were also well, I would say very convincing, but at the end I was a little bit missing the big picture, coming back to the point saying, okay, why do we would have to implement these goals?
There may be more feedback from our judges, but I just want to remind you, although I'm sure you know it, that tomorrow in the, let's see if I get this right, 10-minute and 90-second presentations, the whole mission is to focus on as much as you can on ethics. So I thought some of what was said about ethics and the reference to Robert Solomon, who used to be a very good friend of mine, unfortunately he's passed away, and he was a professor at the University of Texas in Austin. I know that's not Texas State, but
He's our neighbor.
Was good, but you only have a very short amount of time. But you do want to focus on ethics, not so much the legal, not so much the financial, but really, focus in on ethics. And I think what was it, Colleen? Kelly, sorry. I think what she said was very important is that you bring in the very foundations of the corporation. What are the values on which this corporation is based? And what do they imply? What do those values imply if you really want to walk your talk? And if you don't walk your talk, that links back into a lot of what you said in terms of trust, in terms of reputational, ethical reputation, and the implications that has for the growth of your business in terms of shareholder loyalty, consumer loyalty, employee innovation, all of that. I think grounding it.
Exactly. I mean, coming from Europe, I don't know American either, but for example, H&M, it's not only a nightmare for me if I have to go there with my wife. Besides this, Gap.
Oh, you love it.
But Gap, is a brand. You recognize the product. From H&M, you don't really see but Gap, and so it's even more important that you can really you're connected immediately with the group. So that's even more important, I think, that we do something about our ethical standards.
And all of what you just said helps you to really focus in more on the ethical responsibilities that GAP has, and in terms of its values, in terms also of its responsibilities to its stakeholders, which are more than just the stockholders. Even if you could bring in, it might be difficult to cover all of the golden rule in a shorter presentation, so you might want to think about how to capture that in a shorter way to also help focus the ethical aspect of your presentation, which is going to be more important even more important in the next two sessions.
And I understand that whole concept with the trust and the quadrants, but it really hit home when you tied it to our own standards and our own values. Yeah. That's when it really made the connection.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I have to say, as far as persuasiveness, I really had to dig deep to find anything that I thought would remotely contradict what you were saying.
Yeah.
So you did a very good job of being persuasive.
Thank you very much. Spoke with conviction.
Yes.
Which goes a long way.
Yes, absolutely.
It helps that I personally believe it.
That's always
true.
It's always
That's true.
That's right. Okay. Anything you want to ask our judges in terms of feedback? I think you got some good feedback.
I think it's really helpful,
Yeah.
actually, because
Okay.
We're like, we have stakeholders, and then we have this part, what do we? So it is helpful, thank you.
Excellent job. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
And thank you for like volunteering and
Yes.
to do it for us.
You presented.